Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel. Welcome also to December and to my final wrap up of the year, which feels kind of weird to say because there is still a month left of reading, but everything I'm reading now I'm not going to wrap up until January. So these are in fact the last reviews you'll hear from me in the year of our Lord 2023. Hey, that rhymed. I've had a slightly bumpy month altogether, mostly because I've had this cold that has absolutely kicked my butt and I'm really struggling to kick it. I'm still feeling it, to be honest. I ended up having quite a few days off work and I tried to dip into some reading here and there while I was in bed, but because I get so much sinus pain, particularly on this side and like right round to my wisdom tooth and in my ear, every time I get a cold it makes it really hard to focus. So I found myself not always being able to concentrate on books, so I was reaching for stuff that was a bit comforting, stuff that was a bit shorter, things that I could pick up and put down without it being too much trouble. What that meant for my November reading though was that I've ended up with quite an eclectic mixture of stuff. So we've got some literary fiction, memoir, cosy translated bookshop fiction, which weirdly seems to be an emerging genre, going by my local Waterstones at least, a graphic novel, and supercharged human intelligence twice for some reason. Let's get into it, starting with Clear by Carys Davies. Davies is a Welsh author. This is her new novel, or more of a novella really, coming out in January, and I was kindly granted an advance copy by Granta on NetGalley. It's a super short book, treading some of the same territory as Paul Harding's This Other Eden, but in my opinion it does a superior job. Just like This Other Eden, this is about the clearance of an island, but instead of being off the coast of Maine, in this book it's off the coast of Scotland. The book is set in the 1840s at a time when the landed gentry of Scotland are removing people and communities from islands, as they deem them, a bit of a headache, and they want to use that land for more profitable purposes, like sheep rearing. Basically, capitalists being capitalists. Our main character is John. He is a man of the cloth, but he's fallen on hard times and he takes a job to go and remove the last remaining man on one such island. This man's called Ivar, and if he removes him, he gets this handsome payment. He travels to the island, but on his first day there, he suffers a bit of an accident and then wakes up being nursed to health by the man he's supposed to remove. What follows is just this really beautifully written, intimate story about isolation and companionship. The two don't share a language, and I really loved that aspect of the story. John sets out to learn some of Ivar's language and slowly picks up on some words and phrases, but he can't really appreciate some of the differences and nuance between different words for similar things that on the island it's really essential to differentiate, particularly around weather words and words about nature. It brings to mind that old idiom of Inuits having 50 words for snow, but it's done really beautifully here. There's a lot of stuff left unsaid and a lot of nuance in how that aspect of the story is told. There is another strand going on in the background which follows John's wife Mary as she starts to think that John's being taken for a bit of a ride and has been given this job that actually isn't very doable, so she thinks he's in danger and sets off to retrieve him from the island. It all comes together in a really well-earned crescendo and I loved how it ended. I thought it was wrapped up really nicely. Highly recommended, so I would watch out for this one when it's released in January. Next, I read Britney Spears' very buzzy memoir, The Woman in Me, which was ghostwritten by Sam Lansky. I actually listened to this on audio and it was narrated very well by the Oscar-nominated Michelle Williams. I thought this was really great, very conversationally written, super interesting to learn about what was going on behind the scenes, and it was very heartbreaking. There's tragedy from the very first chapter, so prepare yourself for that if you're going to dive into this one. I won't say any more than that now because I've done a full video review of this book, so if you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts, I'll link that review down in the description. It was at this point that I started to feel pretty unwell, and so I turned to a book, or a series rather, that feels like comfort for me, and that is Heartstopper Volume 4 by Aliss Oseman. This is the fourth in the series, the fifth one has just come out, and at this point in the story Nick and Charlie are together, very much in a strong relationship, and the main storyline is about dealing with an eating disorder. It's handled with a lot of care, but I think it's worth knowing that going into it. As ever, the drawings are really lovely, the panels are very nicely composed. Something I really liked about this actually was that there was a way of telling some parts of the story that Aliss Oseman hadn't done before, which is that at certain parts of the book Nick and Charlie are each recounting things in diaries, and the events that they're recounting are drawn out. And what this meant was we got this really nice interior view of the characters that we haven't had at any other point. There is also an iconic Tory moment that I will not spoil, but I loved. But on the flip side, I will trot out the same criticism I do every time I read one of these books, in that there are just like no really morally grey characters. Everyone we are supposed to like is fantastic. They handle every situation with care, and even if they don't get it right first time, they grow and they learn and they get it right eventually. And then everyone who is cast more as a villain is kind of comically bad, and they get their comeuppance at some point or another. There is also a much, much higher percentage of the cast of this book who are LGBTQ+, much more so than I would consider being realistic in the general population. Not quite as high as I seem to see on Booktube and Bookstagram, but not far off. I forgive all of that though, because I really enjoy reading these, and I think they're just really good, like morally good stories that aren't overly fluffy or whimsical, but they make you feel good. And that's what I needed right now. So I'm looking forward to the 5th edition. I'm really glad that that's not where the story's ending. We are getting a 6th book as well, but the 5th is on my Christmas list. So hopefully I'll be reading that sometime soon. Next, I read Days at the Morisaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yagisawa, translated from the original Japanese by Eric Ozawa. This is probably the most beautiful cover of the month, not least because it's got the translator's name on the cover. And I have noticed actually there's a special Christmas edition of this book where there's snow outside and the cat's wearing a little Christmas hat, which is very cute. So if you think that this might be an appropriate gift for someone you are buying for this Christmas, then maybe that would be a good option. I sound like a salesman for the publisher, but this was not gifted. This was actually something Matt bought me because I was feeling really unwell and he thought it might cheer me up. This is set in Tokyo. It's about a young woman called Takako who falls on hard times after her boyfriend, who she thinks loves her, but who she also works with, announces as a surprise that he's marrying someone else, also from the same office. Takako ends up leaving her job, then she can't afford her apartment, and she ends up living in the room above her kinda sorta estranged Uncle Satoru's bookshop. It's a book that feels quite episodic. The first maybe third of the book is a bit like an enemies to lovers romance between Takako and books. She starts off thinking they are a waste of time, and then she falls in love with them, and she falls in love with reading. And I really liked reading about someone enjoying reading. I don't know if that's just a book nerd thing that we're all hardwired to appreciate people who appreciate the thing that we like. While she is going through this and getting back on her feet, she works in the bookshop as well, and we learn a bit about the local community, the characters that frequent the bookshop, and we also meet some of the people who run businesses in the local area, like the owner of the local diner. Then the story gets a little bit more into her uncle's background and the wife he has who has mysteriously left him. Mysterious not in terms of like anything paranormal, but just it's not clear why it was that she decided to leave. She then makes a reappearance, and Takako plays this mediator role in trying to resolve the thing that's happened between them. This is marketed as a bit of a cozy book, and to some extent it is, but there are some heavy and serious topics in here. I guess it's operating in the same kind of space as Before the Coffee Gets Cold, which I didn't massively love. And similarly, I thought this was fine. I enjoyed reading it. The writing is quite simplistic, it's quite an easy thing to read, and I think I'm maybe just not a huge fan of whimsy and coziness. In my reading, that is. I love a cozy life. But yeah, I think I'm probably just not the target audience for this book, and I think people who do like this kind of thing will really, really love it. Still, I spent a nice day in bed reading this book. Well, nice apart from all the sneezing and blowing my nose. But yeah, it was nice. That's my summary. Next, I read a book that I've been meaning to get to for a number of years because I've heard only amazing things about it. And that is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, which, now that I'm holding it up, also has a very strikingly beautiful cover, or at least this edition does. That gold or copper and blue is really working for me. This is a science fiction novel that I guess has a slightly interesting background in that it started life as a short story in the late 50s and was later expanded into a novel and an Oscar-winning film in the 60s. This is a story about a young man called Charlie Gordon who has severe learning difficulties, but he goes through a procedure to increase his intelligence. The procedure is super experimental and it's been trialled on some mice. The titular Algernon is actually a small white lab mouse which has been through the procedure and seen some really promising results. But the scientists are not sure if it's going to work on humans, and even if it does work, they're not entirely sure how long it might last. The story is told via Charlie's progress reports, basically a diary that recount his experience just before and then in the months following his surgery, as he experiences the effects of increased intelligence. I really enjoyed this book. It has a lot of heart, the writing is really engaging, the spelling and grammar reflects where Charlie is on his journey of intelligence. So at the start there's lots of spelling mistakes, there's poor use of punctuation, and that sort of improves over time as he sees the effects of the surgery. It's overall really engaging. Although there's actually not tons and tons of action, the plot is very interesting. But it's all about these interpersonal relationships and how they change as a result of Charlie's intelligence shifting from one mode to another. And something I thought Keyes does a really good job of showing was the isolation Charlie experiences at both ends of the intelligence scale. Before the procedure, Charlie thinks he's got many friends, but people really take advantage of him and disrespect him. He recounts lots of events that he takes as innocent or fun or friendly, but we the reader can see that they're not. So for instance, when he goes out for a drink with some colleagues that he works with at the bakery, they ask him to go around the corner to see if it's raining. But when he very innocently goes to check, they all ditch him and he thinks that they've just got lost or can't find him. It's really sad and it makes you build a lot of empathy with Charlie. At the other end of the scale though, his super intelligence cuts him off from those around him. He can't fathom why everyone can't see things that to him are really, really obvious, and he loses a lot of empathy and emotional understanding. I think that's effectively done, and the parallels are really interesting to think about. Overall, it's a great book, feels very contemporary despite being nearly 60 years old. Algernon on the Mouse is cute AF, and it might well break your heart. Definitely worth a read if you haven't read this one before. Then I was in the mood for a bit of a thriller, a bit of a page turner, something that would be quite pacey and have a lot of momentum. And I did this completely by accident, but maybe I should have known from the title. But straight after Flowers for Algernon, I picked up another book about humans being turned into super intelligent beings, and that was Upgrade by Blake Crouch. This is the third book I've read by Crouch, and it is another techno thriller. It's set in a near future where genetic editing technologies have advanced way beyond the sort of stuff we have now, like CRISPR, but after a global disaster, there's been a massive crackdown, and it's actually illegal to use this new tech. Our protagonist is Logan Ramsey. He's an enforcer of the ban on genetic modification, but also the son of the architect of the technology and of the disaster that happened because of it. Right at the start of the book, he is caught up in this weird raid that goes wrong, and he's infected with a virus that there is suspicion might have changed his DNA, but actually doesn't seem to have had any effect when they check immediately after. That's until weeks later when he starts to feel himself become sharper and stronger, and it turns out he's been upgraded. I don't want to spoil what happens from there, but it's very plot driven, super pacey. There's a lot of science in here, and for me at least, it passes the sniff test. It's maybe not to the Andy Weir level of fake scientific realism, but there wasn't anything that I read that made me roll my eyes and think, well, that's stupid. It felt pretty well researched. There's a really interesting through line throughout the whole story about whether the reason humans can't deal with issues like climate change is because we're too stupid and emotional. And this battle over the idea of whether cold, rational intelligence is the key to solving the problem looms large. I really liked how this was handled, and I liked also how it was resolved. The ending is pretty morally grey in my opinion, but I thought it was very effective. The writing style in this has Crouch's typically clipped style, really short sentences, some paragraphs only a few words long. I don't love this. I think his sentences could be longer, but it wasn't quite as annoying here for me as it was in Dark Matter. I think Recursion is probably still my favourite Blake Crouch book, but if you've read and liked any of his other books, I think you will like this one. The final book I read this month was something very different, and that was Aliss at the Fire by Jon Fosse, translated from the original Norwegian by Damion Searls. Fosse is this year's recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and so I was interested to sample some of his fiction. I think he's probably most well known for his Septology, which is a huge work comprised, I believe, mostly of a single sentence. That sounded quite intimidating to me, and so I picked up this much slimmer volume, which is Aliss at the Fire. This is set in a small village on the banks of a Norwegian fjord, and for the most part takes place on a Tuesday late in November in 2002, which, as it happens, is also when I picked up the book. Not in 2002, but on a Tuesday late in November. It takes place mostly as a woman called Sina sits on a bench in her apartment and thinks back to 20 years earlier when her husband went to check on his boat during a storm and didn't return. His disappearance mirrors another tragedy in his family that happened many, many years earlier, and we move quite seamlessly between all of these stories. Fosse has this really interesting style. Words and phrases are repeated and returned to again and again, thoughts almost falling over each other, and it makes for the building of tension even when not much is happening. He also head hops a lot, jumping not just between characters but between time periods. Sina sees herself standing at the window the night her husband disappears, and then suddenly we're in her head, and while she's looking out the window she sees something out there that may be her husband, and then suddenly we're in his head too. The combination of these techniques felt a little bit like we were orbiting the characters, circling these phrases and ideas, getting closer and closer to another character, and then suddenly we're in their orbit instead. I thought it was really bold and actually really effective. I have to admit, I didn't expect to enjoy this, but I really did. It surprised me, and it moved me emotionally in ways that I didn't quite expect. I think the style of the writing and the humanity and realness of the characters achieved this magic that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I really, really liked it. I'm not sure if I'm ready to take on his doorstopper of the septology, because it is a really intense read and you have to pay attention, and lots of these pages are like walls of text which you can easily lose your place in, especially when there's so much repetition of words and phrases and ideas. But I'm definitely on board for a little bit more Fosse at some point. But yeah, a nice surprise this one, and another lovely Fitzcarraldo to go on my shelves. That's everything I read this month. I did also read quite a lot of Cuddy by Benjamin Myers, but I didn't finish it until the first few days of December, so that review will be coming in January. Spoiler alert, I really loved it. I'd love to know what you've been reading and what your favourite recent reads were, so do let me know in the comments. And if you've read any of the books I talked about today and you have thoughts on them, then let's have a chat down there too. If you enjoyed watching this video, then please do give it a thumbs up, as it really helps my channel out. And if you're not a subscriber yet but you'd like to be, then I'm sure there is a subscribe button on the page that you can click and see even more of my content. But until next time, toodles!